Ukrainian army has breached the first Russian defense line. They're writing that they're breaking through and that the Russians could get into serious troubles. This is some kind of, what's your assessment? What's your point on that? Are they breaking through the defense lines?
No. How many times have we heard this sort of nonsense? Ukraine is marching to victory. The Russians are incompetent, can do nothing right. I've heard this story so many times, and they're talking about Robotyne right now, which is the focus. Robotyne is almost as flat and devoid of people as Kansas in the United States. Whatever was there is gone. The most recent reports suggest that the Ukrainians have managed to sneak into that area at night, but only in armored vehicles for brief periods, and then they rush out as soon as possible because they don't want to be targeted and destroyed by the massive strike assets that are being used to pulverize the entire area. So no, there's no significant advance there whatsoever. Secondly, whenever the Ukrainians have approached the first line of defense, even gotten close to it, they've tried to snap a few photos, photo operation, make it look good, show that they've done something, and then they rapidly withdraw to get out of there because they have taken so many casualties. Remember that the defensive structure is as follows. You have what we would call a security zone in the West. It ranges from 10, 15 to 25 kilometers, depending upon where you are. You have to move through that security zone to really approach the first line of defense. Just getting through that security zone has cost Ukrainians, an estimated 60,000 dead now during the so-called counteroffensive, which has absolutely failed. In this case, they claim to have reached that first line of defense. The principal value of the first line of defense is that it prevents you from seeing the second line of defense, which means that you then become an easy target for destruction. They haven't broken through anything. They're not going to break through anything. They don't have the wherewithal or the capabilities. Everyone who's looked at this, who's remotely objective and not on the payroll for either the major cable news programs or the mainstream media, will tell you, we cannot break through these defenses unless you can eliminate the overhead Russian intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, which identify and target the Ukrainians. Right now, persistence, surveillance over Ukraine puts everything in Ukraine at risk. In other words, you can't go anywhere in that country without being observed. If you can be observed, you're going to be targeted. If you can be targeted, you're going to be hit with something. There's nothing the Russians can't target and destroy. We haven't been able to change that because we cannot destroy the overhead surveillance. Secondly, you've got to be able to counter the massive strike assets, which means you have to identify them and fire against them. Ukrainians can't do it. They don't have sufficient numbers of equipment. They don't have the ammunition. And everyone is looking at the Western equipment saying, well, it's behaving badly. The truth is the Western equipment is not bad, but it's in the hands of people who are unfamiliar with it. They're operating within a framework they don't know, and they don't have the requisite air and missile defense to prevent these forces on the ground from being destroyed. So the entire thing is a fiasco. Nothing is going to change unless the Russians want to change it. And thus far, the Russians have held 300,000 troops in reserve. They are moving very slowly up north and in the eastern part of Ukraine. I think they're going to eventually move further east and then north and probably surround Kharkov. But they're moving slowly, and they're allowing the Ukrainians to essentially sacrifice themselves in great numbers as they move forward up north. Meantime, the rest of the defensive line is intact, and the Russians are not rushing reinforcements anywhere. They don't need to.
From this, we don't hear too much in our media. What are your numbers, and how do you make your own picture? Because it's very hard for us here in Switzerland, for example, to make our own picture. The media are always giving these victory reports, which seem to be a bit, as you described them, a bit off reality. How big are the losses of the Ukrainian forces? What do we have to calculate there?
Well, a few weeks ago, based on the reports that I've been getting from Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, and some others in Eastern Europe, some Bulgarians who are in a position to observe, either directly or indirectly, and are able to talk to people on the ground. I've actually had people call me on cell phones from Ukrainian hospitals to tell me how desperate the situation is. I've tried to put that together along with the numbers of Ukrainian forces committed and then make an evaluation based on fresh graves that are being dug, announcements of deaths in newspapers, obituaries. And I came to the conclusion a few weeks ago that they'd lost 400,000 dead. Now, that's a lot of killed in action. People killed in action than the United States did during the entire Second World War. Now, stop and consider that for a minute. Americans have no idea what this is like. Then, more recently, there were some advertisements about memorials services being held in Ukraine. And the initial advertisement said, "Come and remember the 400,000 who will never return." I think I sent you that. Well, not long after that came out and we had a chance to look at it, it was naturally removed. It had been a mistake. The Ukrainian national leadership got involved and said, take that down immediately because they've been trying to disguise the losses. Now I'm being told the numbers have grown. Now I don't know. I don't follow this every day. If you try to, you're going to end up losing your mind because you have to sift through so many lies from the West, so much disinformation from the Ukrainians. And to be frank with you, the Russians don't say a great deal until something's almost over. So it's very hard to follow every day. I admire the people that try to do that. I tend to wait for a few weeks. And that's why I say this morning I received information that the death toll for this so-called counteroffensive is over 60,000. If that's true, that would raise the number of 400,000 even higher. How much, I don't know. I don't know how much higher you have to raise that toll in order to be horrified by it. I've had enough. I see no point in this. The problem is, and this is very important for your listeners to understand, I think President Putin has always objected to any operation that would essentially destroy more Ukrainian lives unnecessarily. Therefore, he has been reluctant to unleash the offensive power of the Russian military establishment. He's held them back. That has conveyed the impression in the West that there must be something wrong with the Russians because they've obviously annihilated virtually all the things that have been thrown at them. There's not much left in Ukraine. We know that press gangs are operating in Western Ukraine to try and round up anybody they can find that seems remotely capable of carrying a weapon. At the same time, they're now pressuring the Poles to let their people come into Poland and arrest vast numbers of young men from Ukraine who have escaped to Poland. That's how desperate they are. I don't see how this can go on that much longer, but unfortunately, as long as we continue to provide weapons, they will find warm bodies to put against them. I would say until there's nothing left at all. That seems to be the plan of the regime in Kiev.
Have the Ukrainians still the manpower to continue, or are they using all their strategic reserves? Are they running out of personnel? What is your take there?
Well, that's my point. If you go into the Carpathians, where villages are now being raided for manpower, because we see a lot of evidence that the Ukrainians have tried very hard to rely principally on people from rural areas as opposed to urban areas. And then secondly, they've tried to drain the coffers, if you will, in eastern Ukraine first before they stripped out the West. The problem is there have been millions and millions of Ukrainians that have rapidly left the country. Right now, they try to seal the borders. No one gets in and out without being thoroughly checked. No man of military age between, I would say, 16 and 60 is allowed to leave the country under any circumstances. And more recently, the capture of a 71-year-old Ukrainian man who was part of a tank crew that was opposing the Russians. I think they're already scraping the bottom of the barrel. They no longer have any standards. They've tried to empty the prisons. They're bringing people on board, I'm told, who have mental problems, who are psychiatrically incapable. I mean, this is a tragedy beyond anything that we in the West can imagine. And naturally, I think if more people in Germany and Switzerland and Austria and other Western countries knew the truth, they would demand an end to this.
But isn't it totally irresponsible for a leader of a country like President Zelensky, who is hailed like a saint, even in Switzerland, in our parliament, isn't it totally responsible to sacrifice so many lives in a military operation in a war where you are saying it's absolutely impossible to win? The Russians are just too strong, their defenses are too strong. Isn't that utterly irresponsible?
Well, of course, but we have experience with this. We saw Stalin throw millions and millions and millions of lives away. We know that he executed 1 million Soviet soldiers who refused to fight against the Germans. At least 15 million Soviet soldiers were killed, and another 13 to 14 million civilians died. Stalin was a mass murderer on the same scale. We haven't seen that yet, but there's not much difference between him and Zelensky. The interesting thing about Hitler is that most of the heaviest losses occurred in the last 6 to 12 months of the war, when he seems to have decided to throw away life without compunction. But I don't think we've seen anything like this since probably Pol Pot in Cambodia. This is criminal. There's no question about it. But he was picked by this oligarch Kolomoisky, who's now supposedly being arrested for corruption, which seems a little late in the game. But Kolomoisky picked him, groomed him, and essentially installed him as president. Remember, Zelensky ran on a platform and then rapidly turned in the opposite direction. This is a tragic set of circumstances, but one can only assume that Zelensky is doing what the people in Washington and London and probably Paris want him to do.
Well, somehow you see one or two articles in our media saying, well, the offensive is not going as well as expected, but what's your comment on the coverage of our mainstream media?
I urge everyone who asks the same question in the United States to look at the people who own the media, the people that control the financial system, the people at the top of the government. Who are they? Where did they come from? We have a ruling political class in this country that has emerged over the last 20 years. They've always been with us, but they've never been in power as they are right now. That is probably the most radically leftist elite that we've ever had. The so-called Republicans are at best controlled opposition. And those people listening to this who understand what the communist regimes were like in Eastern Europe will appreciate what that means. You in Europe have to do the same thing. Who are the people with the financial power to build up governments with their favored personalities, the people they like? Where are the people who have been governing you for the last 25, 30 years coming from? What do they represent? I think you're dealing with another class of people that emerged during the post-war years with a set of attitudes and values, and they're also beholden, I would argue, to many of the same people that ours are. You have not just domestic or national oligarchs with billions of dollars or euros at their disposal. You have international figures. These people are very difficult to defeat because they can buy up politicians, buy up political support. And in Washington, people are reluctant to tell the truth and to move to a different position until they see absolute evidence that the people that put them where they are can't harm them. In other words, people are afraid. But look what happens in much of Europe. You stand up and say, well, I think this war in Russia is wrong. Well, why? We have to destroy Russia. And somebody says, why? Well, Russia's evil. Well, why? It's not communist. Well, it's bad. Well, why? And you get the same thing. Well, if you talk like this, you have to be censored. In England, they're talking about putting people in jail. I mean, it's incomprehensible. Talk about free speech. It's the antithesis of it. One wonders why we bothered fighting the last World War. It's appalling. So I can't tell you these 5 people are responsible in Germany or Switzerland, France. I'm telling you and the people listening, go find out who's bankrolled by whom. My experience is follow the money. If you follow the money, you'll get an answer.